Okay, thank you for staying until the last talk. It's an honor for me to... Thank you, Nele. Anyway, it's an honor for me to have the last contribution, also in a way because I will continue where Dominique stopped yesterday. Because it is the last contribution, I want to start with something light. This is a Dutch cartoon. Maybe a bit silly. But anyway, what I'm talking about today is a little bit different from what I usually do. Unprovenanced Old Babylonian tablets since 1990. It's also not my intention to accuse colleagues working with unprovenant texts, because that I would be a hypocrite. I have worked with unprovenanced material myself in the past. However, my thinking about unprovenanced material from Iraq has changed in the last few years. On the one hand, because I've been working in the field of heritage studies the last few years, not in Assyriology, and also because I've been to Iraq a number of times and I've seen the destruction on sites, and that has left a huge impression on me. Well, this is my introduction, more or less. I want to talk about the first wave of unprovenanced material that was looted from Iraq and the second wave. But first, some backgrounds. To publish or not to publish, that is the question. The way I see it, working with unprovenanced material is like a spectrum. Either you're on one end of the spectrum, and I think David Owen is a proponent of that. He says that basically it is our duty as Assyriologists to publish everything we can get our hands on, or else it might be lost. On the other part of the spectrum is Neil Brodie, not an Assyriologist, but an archaeologist turned criminologist, who says that it is unethical and an affront to the Iraqi cultural heritage to publish unprovenanced material. And I think most of us are somewhere in between, but as I said earlier, I tend to lean more to the Neil Brodie side nowadays. So I don't claim to have to be the only one who came to this insight, but Assyriology is not something that we do in a vacuum. It's not something neutral or innocent. It's something that we do in the real world, and we're working with real people. And the fact that Iraqi cultural heritage has been looted and has been funneled through the antiquities trade to collections that we as Assyriologists read is something real. And in general, I think that there's not a lot of thinking in Assyriology concerning what I have called here the philosophy of Assyriological science. Our focus is still a lot on philology, but there's not a lot of thinking on things like epistemology or ontology. Why do we make certain categorizations? For example, why do we talk about the Old Babylonian period still, whereas we all know that it's not a very useful indicator? But also, how do we construct our knowledge? For example, why do we engage so little with archaeologists? So to sum up, I think that Assyriology in working with unprovenanced material is not something neutral, or as a post-processual archaeologist like Ian Hodder would say, we are entangled in the material that we are working with. So first, on the first wave on unprovenanced material from Iraq. Ever since it became clear after the 1850s, when cuneiform script had been deciphered, that money was to be had by digging up tablets and other parts of cultural heritage from Iraq, Syria, Iran, and whatever, local people, but also people from the West, started to scout sites to look for treasures, cuneiform tablets, etc. This nice picture that you see here, this is Ernest de Sarzec. I think maybe some French Assyriologists might have recognized him. But to curb already the looting of cuneiform tablets in the Ottoman Empire at that time, Ottoman authorities already issued laws in 1874 to stop this. So it's already been banned for 150 years. Of course, this is a French translation. The original would have been an Ottoman Turkish, but I don't think that anybody here reads Ottoman Turkish. And especially look at Article 3, every antiquity not discovered, gisant, staying underneath the ground, wherever it might be, is state property. Well, the Ottoman Empire, apparently from what I read in the literature, it was still possible, despite the laws, to circumvent the Ottoman laws and to still loot sites, smuggle material, trade material, etc. Then the First World War came and the Ottoman Empire lost. Large parts of the Ottoman Empire were cut up by the colonial powers. Turkey itself barely remained independent thanks to Atatürk, and the modern state of Iraq was put together by combining 3 former Ottoman provinces, Mosul, Baghdad and Basra. This was done by the British, who also ruled Transjordan and Israel-Palestine, and what they did is they appointed a vassal king. This man, Faisal I, he was a sheikh from Mecca. He also claimed family ties to the Prophet Muhammad, but by all accounts, this is Lawrence of Arabia, by the way, by all accounts, he was a puppet king of the colonial British administration. For better and for worse, I think we all know that Gertrude Bell was instrumental in proposing a number of new Iraqi laws to stop the trade in antiquities, but for worse also because Iraq was not independent and was still part of the British colonial empire until at the end of the 50s, the Iraqi royal family was deposed by Abdul Qadir al-Qasim. Then this first wave of text resulted in the collections that we know nowadays. This is the Old Babylonian collection, and this is the British Museum. And here are some other ones. And this first wave of text is the number of led to the archives that we now have studied and that are still in these bigger collections, like the private archives from Sippar, Larsa, the Manana texts, part of the Hana texts, the Uruk-Asierum archive, texts from Kusura, Pikasi, Lagaba, etc. Plus a number of wealthy collectors such as Erlenmeyer, Harper and Morgan. And I think that publishing these first wave texts is more or less a never-ending story that we're still engaged with. We're still trying to make sense of what happened during this first phase of looting. Then the second wave, from 1990 onwards. Well, I think we all know the story. Saddam Hussein, after he had lost the war with Iran, he tried to invade Kuwait. An international coalition was not happy with that. Saddam Hussein was defeated, but the international coalition did not drive all the way up to Baghdad to depose Saddam Hussein, and as a result, the Iraqi people were treated to 10 years of embargo. Already during that time, in the 1990s, sites in Iraq were started, well, let me say before 1990, the situation in Iraq in terms of protection of sites was more or less good. But in the 1990s, due to the embargoes and due to opportunism from several members of the Ba'ath Party, sites began to be looted in the south. And what I read in the literature is that especially Arshad Yassin, the guy on the left, he was a brother-in-law of Saddam Hussein, was instrumental in funneling a number of archaeological objects from Iraq. Then we have the 2003 US invasion, which resulted, as we all know, in civil war and looting that ran all the way up to 2017 when ISIS was finally defeated. So I often wonder, and maybe you do as well, how much material has actually been looted from Iraq, and how many parts how many of the material that was actually smuggled were fakes. As you can see here, on the left are some legitimate objects, on the right are obvious fakes. Elizabeth Stone did some research on the scale of looting in Iraq in 2008 and 2015 by looking at satellite images, and she concluded that hundreds of thousands of objects had to be spirited away from Iraq. I don't know about hundreds of thousands, but I do think at least tens of thousands if we're only talking about cuneiform tablets, because only now we are able to draw up an overview. One major problem that I signal is that the first wave of texts came to major collections, and these are more or less publicly accessible, plus a number of select wealthy collectors. But the second wave texts came to a number of large collectors, Rosens, Keuyen, Musayev, the Green Hobby Lobby collection. Some of them have already been returned to Iraq, but I think the real problem is that large parts of the Iraqi heritage have been sold to whoever can spare 200 euros. And that was not the case 100 years ago, where, as I say, only select wealthy collectors could buy the material. And this is just an overview of the number of collections that I was able to find where unprovenanced material came from from 1990 onwards. Some of them might be wrong, but at least the list is impressive. And thinking about this, I thought, what if we turn it around? How would people from the United Kingdom feel if Stonehenge was in the garden of the Iraqi Museum? Well, after this a little bit lengthy introduction, you are of course curious to know what the extent of Old Babylonian material is unprovenanced that has been published, because I only looked at the published material. I didn't look at CDLI to see how many of the unassigned unpublished texts are from unprovenanced material. I also didn't look at scholarly texts or literary texts. I only counted letters and economic administrative texts. For this, I also need to acknowledge, of course, Archival, which is an indispensable tool for this kind of research, and the Iraqi website iasj.net. I wanted to thank Laurent for pointing out this website to me, but he spirited away just before my presentation. I think he needs to be home. He needs to be home. I think this website is also a great example of open access. As you can see, almost all of the Iraqi scholarly output is freely available through this website. And I think this is something that a lot of Western states can learn from. So I will show you a number of graphs. It says here table. I'll first have some water and I'll let you look at it for a second. So the blue line is the number of texts per year that have been published for the Old Babylonian period. The orange line is the amount of first wave texts, and the gray line is the amount of second wave texts. So you can see that the second wave texts in publication start to pick up from 2006 onwards. And here below you see the totals. So I counted a total of 11,400 published Old Babylonian texts. 31% of that stems from the first wave, and a little bit more than 10% is second wave texts, or are second wave texts, so probably unprovenanced material from Iraq since the 1990s. This is a graph that puts it a little bit different. You see here, again, the blue line is the total number of new texts. The orange line is the number of official texts. So red more or less shows the knowledge gap if we only used texts from official excavations. And the peaks in publications of the peaks in publication of official texts are mostly due to the Mari material. Or differently put, without the Mari material and without unprovenanced texts, we would have very little to work with. I think this is also an interesting graph because, as you can see, starting from 2012, Iraqi scholars also started publishing second wave texts. These are confiscated texts in the Iraq Museum. And I think this is a very good example of Iraqi scholars making good of this heritage catastrophe. Oh, and some numbers you see below. So the total amount of second wave publications is about 1,200, and about 16% of it is the work of Iraqi scholars and colleagues. Then you might be interested in the major text groups from the Old Babylonian period that are part of this unprovenanced material. So I have here a map of southern Mesopotamia, and I overlaid the modern cities. By far the biggest group is Dur Abi Eshur. I counted 386 texts. We have the Irisagric text dated by Malgum kings. I counted 143. A little bit of an outlier is the Royal Archive of King Iluni. I counted 71 texts. If you've never heard about this, this is a group of texts from a king of Eshnunna who ruled contemporaneously with Samsu Iluna. It's a very interesting text group that gives us insight into the political situation in the Zagros around that time. The largest part of this archive has been published by Basma Abed, by the way, an Iraqi professor. Then we have the Sumuel letters, Rimsin correspondence. There's much more material for this group, so this is only published. Then we have the Naptanu texts that Gregory just talked about. I counted 48 texts, but that is because I don't have the thesis of Ali Murad. The Ibn archive, now in the Banca d'Italia. Ilum Tayar, this is an archive from Isin, Isin group in Italy. Soldiers from Sabum, that's a group in the US. The Abul Nibru group, plus numerous other small looted text groups. So just text groups for which I could only find out that 3 texts seem to belong together, or 4 texts, something like that. As you can see here, except for Iluni, most of these text groups that have been looted from Iraq are from the area, broadly speaking, between Nasiriyya and Diwaniyya. And this is also the result of the research that was done by Manuel Molina, for example, concerning the Ur III material. And this was also the conclusion that Elizabeth Stone had for the looting right after and right before the US invasion in 2003. Then I will show you some numbers of the total of about 1,200 texts, to which kingdoms they were dated. So 195 could be dated to the Larsa kingdom, 105 to the Eastern kingdom, 6 to Kisura. Undetermined text that I could not determine for having a date, for example, letters or lists, but that they were from southern Mesopotamia was nevertheless clear, 380. For the Babylonian kingdom, I only found 9 texts, if I exclude the Dur Abi Eshur material. And for northern Mesopotamia in general, I could only find 9 texts. So this is Tigunanum, Shechna. So it just shows that really the major part of the looting took part here in southern Iraq. I think this is clear. This doesn't mean that other sites weren't also looted, but the most happened here. And I read in some publications actually that it was a gang, a group of people from a village near Nasiriyah called Al-Fajr that were particularly active in this looting. So I think I'm doing very well in terms of time. I have more questions than conclusions. This photo that you see here, this is Malgum. Some of you who know my work know that I published a lot on Malgum. I'm very excited by the site, but as you can see, the site of Malgum was also heavily looted. So a lot of the material is still unpublished. Despite the fact that a lot has been returned to Iraq, there's still a large part of the Rosen collection in New York that's unpublished. The Scoian material is still unpublished. And as I said, there are many small collections for which I don't know if, I don't know how much of this smaller material has been sold and to whom. Also, there must be much more. I mean, if we look at a site like Malgum, which is a fairly big tell, as far as I know, no Malgum material has surfaced. I mean, there has been Malgum material from Irisagrik, but nothing from the site of Malgum itself. Also Kisura. I also visited Kisura. Kisura is gone, for at least half of the site is destroyed. And if you remember earlier, only 6 Kisura texts have surfaced or have been published. So where is all of this material? And I think part of the equation are non-Western collections, Gulf states, the Far East, because up until now the unprovenanced material comes from Western collections. And I only heard hearsay that in the Gulf states there must be large collections, and some Assyriologists went there, looked at material for the Far East, China, Japan, I don't know, but there also must be material over there. Connected to this is that in the publications I only read about smuggling through Jordan. For example, in 1999, a group of texts had been confiscated at the Iraqi-Jordan border. Part of these are the Naptanu texts that Gregory talked about, but they also must have smuggled through Syria, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and I have no information on this. Another question I have is the money trail. Who benefits? Cui bono? And people like Neil Brody, who study this material, also say that they only have to rely on public information like auction catalogs and things like that, but they don't know what's going on underneath the counter, how Iraqi material is being sold, smuggled, etc. And who earns the most money? Another question that I have is that we don't really have an overview of looted sites, at least not that I know of. I mean, Elizabeth Stone worked with digital images from the satellites, but and we have the Eamena project, of course, in Oxford, But as far as I know, there's not really yet an overview of the scale of destruction. And up until now, I only talked about cuneiform tablets, but what about other objects? Coins, terracotta plaques, cylinder seals. So I think it will take many years for us to understand the scale of Iraqi's heritage catastrophe. And I think it's our obligation to work together with Iraqi colleagues in undoing some of this. Well, we can't undo it, but somehow to make sense of it. Thank you.